Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Ricardo Chavira. I'm a lecturer at UC Irvine. I'm also a lecturer at Cal State Fullerton. Today I want to talk about mass media and the creation of global society. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me. Before I became a teacher, I was a journalist for about 28 years. As a journalist, I was fortunate enough to win a Pulitzer Prize. For those of you who are wondering what a Pulitzer Prize is, think of it as an Oscar, only it's for those of us who write. I continue to write and I continue to teach writing. What I'd like to talk to you again about today is mass media and the creation of a global society. Let me talk a little bit about those terms so we can understand the topic more fully. First of all, I want to describe media, old and new. Media is a plural term. It means more than one. Media is how we get information. Traditional media include such things as TV, radio, newspapers, and magazines. Some of you still use this kind of media. If you watch TV, listen to the radio, or read a magazine, or occasionally a newspaper, you're reading traditional media. But more and more of us are using what are now called new media, such things as PCs, laptops, cell phones. I'd like to talk a little bit about media history. How did we become a global media society? Before I talk about the history, let me define what a global society is. A global society is a neighborhood except that it's worldwide. The new media that I just talked about has made the world smaller by allowing us to communicate instantly. If you've ever sent a text message to another country, an email to another country, you are participating in the global society. If you've traveled to another country, you are part of the global society. Many years ago, the media were pioneers in creating a global society. How did that happen? We had, from this country, American journalists who went to foreign countries. They went to those countries and lived there and wrote about them and told us about life in countries as far away as South Africa, Germany, Japan, and Cuba. Until recently, foreign correspondents were based all over the world. Recently, many of these foreign correspondents have had to come home for economic reasons. We will be talking about that. But the point here is that many years ago, before your parents were born, in fact, even before your grandparents were born, the American mass media, American journalists were pioneers in creating a global society. I'd like you to think for a minute about 3 stories you consider most important. Explain why they matter to you and other Americans. After you've thought that through, I'd like you to take a minute or 2 to think about what country you would like most to visit, and then explain why. Some of you have been to foreign countries, but there are other countries that you may have dreamed of going to, or maybe not. But think a minute about the country you'd like to go to and explain why. Now I'd like you to think of these 3 stories and describe which one do you think is newsworthy. The first is the economy. Now, we all know that the economy is in some trouble. We're hoping that the economy gets better. But even in good times, the economy is important to us because it's what puts food on the table, it's what keeps our parents employed, and some of you may already have jobs. So we all care about money and how it comes to our households. Second story I'd like you to think about are celebrity scandals. Let me describe this a bit. More and more news media are concerned about, people like Chris Brown and Rihanna. As you may know, they were involved in a domestic dispute. But even aside from them, there are other celebrities that are constantly involved in scandals, and they become newsworthy. Another story to consider are possible changes in the class schedule at your school. The question is, which of these do you think are newsworthy? That is, are important to you and perhaps to other people. We've been talking about news. And there are different ways to define it. Rather than talk about a long definition, let me give you some of the characteristics, things that make news what it is, things that define news. First of all, news should be timely. What does timely mean? It means it happened just now or very recently. If it's 2 weeks ago, more often than not, that becomes recent history. But if it's happening right now, then it's news. Relevant. Relevant means that it matters to you. It has something to do with you. A story that would be relevant, for example, would be if your school was going to close. It's relevant to you because it affects you. Important. Information that is important is a little like relevant, although it may not affect you directly. If there is a tragedy that happens in Washington, D.C., it may not have a direct impact on you, but it's important. Interesting is another one of those terms that is really in the eye of the beholder. Interesting simply would draw you into it. For example, many sports stories are not exactly important because, after all, sports are just a game. But if your favorite team makes a trade, if your favorite team wins a championship, it's interesting to you because you have a natural attraction to it. Another definition of news is something that is out of the ordinary, something that you can't believe happens. For example, if a expectant mother gives birth to octuplets, 8 babies being born, it's interesting, but it's also out of the ordinary. And people such as yourselves could be very interesting or very interested in that. So these elements are characteristics of what defines news. What do reporters think of their profession these days? As some of you may know, journalism is in a crisis. In another presentation, we can talk about what caused this crisis, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but right now, what I'd like you to focus on is what reporters think about their profession these days. The answer might surprise you. About half of all journalists, 51% at the national news media and 46% at the local level, think that journalism is going in the wrong direction. Recall that I just mentioned that journalism has undergone some cuts, and they believe, these journalists who are expressing displeasure at the fact that journalism is going the wrong direction, believe that journalism is focusing too much on the bottom line. The bottom line means profits, and this focus on profits, making money, is seriously hurting the quality of journalism. So the information, the quality of information that you get, whether it's on TV, radio, or the internet, has gone down, has become less than what it should be. International journalists is the next topic I'd like to discuss with you. As many of you may know, reporting is unlike most jobs because it requires journalists to have a solemn duty. If you are a journalist, you have a duty to inform truthfully. That is, not to lie, not to distort, not to present things that are not based on facts. That is a duty. It's not against the law to do that unless you hurt somebody's reputation, but you do have a duty. Opinions and prejudices and biases, that is, if you believe that somebody is a bad person, does not have a place in reporting. Reporting is to present information in a factual, objective fashion. The other part of being a journalist requires you to work 24/7 when necessary. That means you will, as a journalist, start to report and write on a story from the moment it begins, I should say, to the moment it ends. A good example are fires, which we unfortunately have a number of here in Southern California. When a brush fire begins and homes are threatened, you will notice that TV reporters, to cite one example, begin to report and inform the public, inform local residents about what's happening. That reporting will continue until the fire is out and homes are safe and we know what damage has occurred. That's a good example of reporters doing their work 24/7. They don't say, oh, it's 5 o'clock, let me go home. They stay with it, or another reporter comes and takes his or her place. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about international media and key issues. There are many things happening in the world. As many of you know, the world has become a more unpredictable and dangerous place. We have, unfortunately, the plague of terrorism. We have American troops fighting in Afghanistan most prominently. So we have a world that is much more complicated and in many ways dangerous. Some of the issues that you may be interested in following, and journalists certainly do pay a lot of attention to, are the causes of terrorism. We know that people plant bombs, sometimes killing themselves, and unfortunately many others, as happened in 9/11, the 9/11 tragedy, terrorist attack on the U.S. What are some of the major causes of terrorism? That's one key issue to think about. Another is human and drug trafficking. People and drugs get brought across borders, very often to this country. And that has obvious problems. If our borders aren't respected, then we don't know what people are coming in. And if drugs are coming across our borders, which they are unfortunately, that's a serious problem for our society. We know the problems and the great harm that drugs cause. The other question to ponder, for you to think about, is how do news stories from abroad help us understand how Americans are similar to those in other countries? A good example are natural disasters. When we've had big hurricanes come across our country, as in the case of Hurricane Katrina, which you may have learned about in your class, or we have earthquakes, as we've had here in California, many of them before when you were probably little children, or we have other disasters in other parts of the country. And we see the same thing happen in other countries. We have hurricanes happening in other countries. Those things help us relate to the world. If we see other people undergoing similar difficulties, heartbreak, and pain, we can relate to them. When we have economic troubles in this country and we see other countries undergoing them, it creates a sense of relevancy. It reaffirms the sense that we do live in a global society. We don't live apart. Our world is interconnected. One big change has happened in the media. Recall that I just mentioned a few minutes ago the new media. Many of you are users of the new media. In fact, even older people as old as myself, are users of the new media. Facebook, YouTube, blogs, and text messaging are some of the ways that the new media are being utilized. Facebook, you might be interested to know. I'm sure many of you have Facebook accounts, Facebook pages. You might be interested to know that there are about 200 million users right now. And every day, 700,000 new members sign up. YouTube, how many of you have watched YouTube? Probably all of you. 100 million viewers, that's right, 100 million viewers watch YouTube every day. About 70 million videos are up on YouTube. I'm sure that figure is probably a little bit conservative because every day new videos get uploaded. Blogs. Many of you have blogs. In fact, 40% of American high school students have blogs. There are about 133 million blogs posted since 2002. And every year, many more. In fact, every day, thousands and thousands of new blogs get posted. Text messaging. Now, some of you may text message at least once a day, but you might be surprised to know your one-a-day text message is only one of a billion. That is, 1 billion, not a million, 1 billion text messages get sent every day. And more, the cell phone is the device that the new media is using to get out messages. Now, I'd like you to think a little bit about the future of the media. When I was your age, there was no such thing as the internet. Well, if there was, we certainly weren't aware of it. It would have been hard for me to imagine at your age, sitting where you are, what the future of the media was, because we used to write on typewriters. Some of you may not have ever seen a typewriter. So I'd like you to look at a crystal ball and think, how do you think you will receive news about the world in the future? Cell phone, some new device that's never been created? What do you think? What kinds of stories do you think are not being reported? Now, you know that there are many stories that are available to you on the internet. You can read about all sorts of things happening in the world. But if you think about it, there's probably something happening around you in your neighborhood, perhaps even at this school, that you think are important and that people should know about that aren't being reported. What are some of those stories? Final thing I'd like you to think about is, how does music influence what you know about the world? Many musical groups are from foreign countries. In my time, the Beatles was the main musical group. And of course, the Beatles aren't American, they're British. There are other groups that are similarly based in foreign countries, but music is a way that we get united. How does that influence what you know about the world? I'd like you to think about this quote from an American sociologist named Peter Berger. And it says, "We have a cultural phenomenon, the emergence of a global culture, or of cultural globalization." Let me just talk a minute about that. As I said early in this presentation, the world is becoming smaller. Not that the globe exactly has shrunk, but the way we communicate with each other has become much faster. When I was your age, it was rare to know anybody that had ever been outside the United States. Now many of you have been far away. Some of you have been to Latin America, some of you have been to Europe, perhaps even to Asia. The reason you were able to get to those countries so easily is because we have many more flights. And the internet has allowed us to connect in a way that's instantaneous. I communicate with people in 4 or 5 countries, sometimes more than once a day. So, in summary, what I'd like to say is that the media and the global society are very important factors in your life. Too often we think of ourselves as just a local community, that we are a community called Orange County. But if you sit and ask one of your neighbors, or perhaps even yourself, where did you come from? Many of you have parents that were born in other countries. Many of you are from other countries. Many of you have been to other countries. And as we move forward as a society, we are going to become more and more interconnected. And the media are going to help us remain so. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you again soon.